if you had an explosion in the engine that destroyed the fire loops with the explosion that created the fire, you wouldn't get a fire indication. You'd certainly know something had happened as a pilot, but you may not get any indications that something had happened. You may be looking at your instruments. There's no fire indication. If you looked at your engine gauges, they may just all disappear. You may get blanks. So it was very confusing. I went through it. I experienced it. The first time I saw it, I didn't know what had happened. I had no idea what happened. The person I was flying with had no idea what happened. It's why they demonstrated to it, showed it to us. I've only done that once in a fairly long career. I've only had one simulated engine separation event. So it's not a common thing to be trained for. It's not a common thing to be on the minds of pilots. Hello, welcome back. I know a lot of you have seen the recent video, UPS Flight 2976, a scheduled departure from Louisville, Kentucky to Oahu on Hawaii, Honolulu. The unfortunate accident that took place was an MD-11F aircraft operated by UPS. Crashed during takeoff, Louisville International Airport around 5:15 local time. Yesterday, we were reporting 3 crew members on board the aircraft have all perished. We know that there's, at this point, about 9 total that have perished. There still are a number of families who have said that loved ones who were known to be in the area are unaccounted for at this time, so that number may go up. 11 injuries, that's the latest data. Obviously was pretty devastating, pretty big fireball, a lot of fuel aboard the aircraft, 8+ hour flight from Louisville to the Hawaii Islands, which means that they would have been carrying an awful lot of gas aboard that MD-11 aircraft. There has been release of pictures and videos of what appears to be an engine which had separated from that aircraft during the takeoff roll. We also have video which depicts what looks like a fairly significant fire emanating from the location of the number 1 engine. Another important consideration here is the fact that the tail-mounted engine on that MD-11 very well may have ingested some of the debris that was being napalmed, grenaded out by the number 1 engine, that dramatic failure of the number 1 engine. Obviously enough force to compromise the cowling, probably sent a spray of debris pretty wide and far. Certainly upwards would have been one of the directions that may have sent some debris, and if that was ingested in the tail-mounted number 2 engine on the MD-11, then that would have compromised 2 out of 3 engines, which would have meant that the crew would not have had enough thrust to continue the flight. So another real possibility here, the number 1 engine failed right at the V1 speed, and then the aircraft just could not accelerate at all. Maybe slowed down even a little bit, was decelerating a little bit, but once you've hit that decision speed, you're locked into flying the aircraft. The alternative is a high-speed overrun. There's been a lot of accidents, particularly in the corporate world, that have occurred when pilots have attempted to reject above V1. So we're taught pretty aggressively not to do that. So it's possible this aircraft, in fact, had reached V1 speed, very close to V1 speed, and then just could not accelerate from there. The NTSB is probably on the ground right now, starting to sift through the remains, searching for the cockpit voice recorder, the flight data recorder. Have a lot more information when those devices come out, but there are a few things we can say right now. Obviously, the apparent significant damage to the number 1 engine, what we would refer to as an uncontained engine failure. The cowling around the aircraft engines that you're used to seeing on big turbojet aircraft are there for 2 reasons. One is aerodynamic. They smooth the airflow around the engine, allow the aircraft to go faster, less drag, be more fuel efficient. The second reason those cowlings are there is to protect in the event that there is some sort of damage which occurs to the engine. Turbine engines do have many, many fan discs that are operating at very high rotational speeds. And if there is some sort of fracture to one of those fan discs or one of the compressor discs, it will create an imbalance within that engine at high rotational speed. It will generate an extraordinary amount of vibration, and the vibration will cause the engine basically to shake itself apart. And then many of those discs, those fan blades, elements that break free will essentially become like a grenade. It'll grenade, it'll be shrapnel, it'll hit other components within the cowling, it will create damage. The cowling is partially there to prevent those fragments from separating and hitting the fuselage, killing passengers aboard the fuselage. Southwest flight a couple years ago, a passenger died when an uncontained failure blew the window out and sucked the passenger out. In this case, it's pretty clear when we view it that this engine grenaded itself pretty significantly. The cowling was not sufficient to contain that within the engine itself towards the leading edge, the inboard leading edge of the left wing, which would have been the approximate location of the left engine. We assume that that fire was coming from broken fuel lines that were dumping raw fuel into a hot section that ignited and created the fire as the aircraft was taking off. So we have that video evidence at this point in time. We also have what appears to be reliable picture and video evidence of the separation at some point of that engine from the airframe. The engine came to rest sort of longitudinally oriented in the direction that the aircraft was traveling down the runway. It appears it's right by a windsock, which would indicate that it was towards the end of the runway, just before where the aircraft would have rotated to have taken off, to have departed. The UPS MD-11, this aircraft in this particular incident, is a derivative of the DC-10. So Douglas Corporation 10, McDonnell and Douglas merged some years ago. They formed MD, McDonnell Douglas. MD-11 is just the subsequent version of the DC-10. There are some startling similarities with American Airlines Flight 191 as a DC-10 departure in 1979, regularly scheduled domestic passenger flight from O'Hare International Airport in Chicago to Los Angeles International Airport. The National Transportation Safety Board found that as the aircraft was beginning its takeoff rotation, engine number one, the left engine, separated from the left wing, flipping over the top of the wing and landing on the runway. As the engine separated from the aircraft, it severed hydraulic lines that lock the wing's leading edge slats in place and damaged a 3-foot section of the left wing's leading edge. The slats on the aircraft are forward elements of the aircraft used for takeoff and landing. It increases lift. It reduces stall speed. When the number one engine departed from the aircraft on American Airlines Flight 191, this DC-10, it resulted in other systems abnormalities, failures. Number one generator was lost. Everything on the number one side was lost, including captain's instruments and, critically, the captain's stick shaker. On this particular aircraft, there's only one stick shaker. Stick shakers alert the pilots to the fact that they're going too slow. They need to speed up. They're about to enter an aerodynamic stall, which at low altitude is highly likely to produce a fatal event. The first officer's control column did not have a stick shaker. That changed in the aftermath of this crash. They required stick shakers on both sides of the aircraft. They required electrical architecture that pretty much assured all of the flight deck items. So the avionics, the navigational systems, the stall alerting, all of that stuff would work seamlessly in the event of a loss of a generator. That automatically the architecture from an electrical standpoint would power everything for the pilots, so the pilots wouldn't notice any difference as far as the equipment that was functioning, the electronic equipment that was functioning. In this case, that didn't take place, so they dealt with not only an engine failure, but a significant electrical loss of electrical capability, a reduction of the electronic system in front of them to confound the situation, to further confuse the situation. Now, we should say, as I've said, that's all been fixed. So this is American Airlines Flight 191. This wouldn't have been the situation just recently here with the UPS 2976 with that incident. They would have had all the electrical items, although they would have lost the electrical generators on the number one engine. They also would have lost the number one hydraulic pump. There's usually an electric pump backup. Even with the failure, complete failure of the number one side in this MD-11 should have, from a pilot standpoint, functioned very similar to an aircraft that had that number one engine. The main difference being obviously loss of thrust, and since it's the number one engine, you would have had some asymmetric thrust as well. But that's something that pilots are trained for. We're trained on a yearly basis, extensively trained in how to depart with an engine failure during a high-speed portion of the takeoff roll, to climb the aircraft out, to get it configured appropriately for the failure, and return to the airport for a safe landing. On the DC-10 in the American Airlines Flight 191, these slats, which enhance the lift capabilities of the wing and reduce the stall speed of the wings, are extended hydraulically. There was no mechanical lock on the DC-10 in 1970. The number one hydraulic system operated the number one slats. So with the reduction in pressure in the number one hydraulic system, the aerodynamic loads on the slats basically pushed the slats into the retracted position. And then the crew did what they were supposed to do from there, which is follow the flight director, which gave them a pitch indication that would have been consistent with a climb speed about 155, 160 knot. Initially, when you have an engine failure at low altitude, or particularly right at rotation on the runway, the first thing you need to do is you need to get away from the ground. So you don't have the room to accelerate. You don't have the time to accelerate. You want to climb first. So you climb at a safe speed, but a non-efficient speed until you get to a specified altitude, usually somewhere around 1,000 feet. And then you accelerate the aircraft to a more efficient climb speed. And then you climb from there. You run all the checklists. Hopefully you come back around and you land safely. American Airlines Flight 191, the first officer was flying. He pitched up to obtain this V2 speed, this climb speed, which was appropriate for an engine failure. The crew had no idea because they didn't have a stick shaker. They didn't have a lot of electrical equipment aboard the aircraft working. They had no idea that that slat had retracted on the left side, which meant that the one engine and operative climb speed was too slow. So they wound up pitching up to a speed that was too slow. Left wing stalled, aircraft rolled inverted, and then it went into the ground. Very similar to what happened with UPS out of Louisville yesterday. The aircraft rolled to the left. You can see in the video right before it crashed. It appears as though the number one engine, the left engine, separated from the aircraft. So this is very similar to American Airlines Flight 191, but there are obviously some critical differences there. So similarities and differences. Robert Graham, a supervisor of maintenance for American Airlines, he made this statement: "As the aircraft got closer, I noticed what appeared to be vapor or smoke of some type coming from the leading edge of the wing and the number one engine pylon." This would have been just prior to the separation of the engine. Obviously, in the event yesterday with UPS, there's a lot of fire coming from that location. Ultimately, they would find in the American Airlines crash that due to a maintenance practice, there had been some damage to the number one pylon. There had been stress fractures over the course of several flights. Those stress fractures had gotten worse and worse and worse, and then they had eventually failed on this particular flight. So the engine separated at the pylon. It doesn't appear that that's what happened with UPS. It's looking now, based upon the significant flames and fire we see out of the number one engine, that the engine grenaded. It created a shrapnel field. It did extraordinary amount of damage, maybe damaged the engine mountings, destroyed the cowling, and then at some point separated from the airframe. So there's a bit of a difference there. And then obviously we see fire as opposed to vapor or smoke. So they saw vapor or smoke come from the left wing of the number one engine pylon. Again, this is Robert Graham. I noticed that the number one engine was bouncing up and down quite a bit, and just about the time the aircraft got up to my position and started rotation, the engine came off, went up over the top of the wing, and rolled back down on the runway. We don't see the engine going over the top of the wing here. Probably went over the top of the wing in the case of American Airlines because it was still producing thrust, and so it just rocketed itself. Whereas yesterday, with the severe damage, that engine was probably not producing any thrust. So when it finally detached from the aircraft, it may have just dropped from the aircraft. The aircraft continued a fairly normal climb until it started to turn to the left. At that point, I thought it was going to come back to the airport. That left turn was because the left wing was beginning to stall. The right wing was still producing lift. And then it rotated to over 100 degrees, basically inverted, and then crashed into a trailer park. In response to the accident, slat relief valves were mandated to prevent slat retraction in case of hydraulic line damage. If that had been aboard the aircraft in this accident, given the performance of the crew, they just would have climbed away on the remaining two engines. They would have run some procedures. They would have returned to landing in Chicago. Everyone would have survived. We're looking at the flight radar data of UPS Flight 2976, where they show the maximum altitude 175 feet. It doesn't really look to me like the aircraft actually obtained 175 feet, but it's showing a maximum climb to 175 feet. This would be, taxi here, 21 knots. As you follow the trace, they're taxiing runway. This is the point where they begin accelerating. Now it shows the acceleration reach 186 knots, and then the acceleration just sort of stops at that point. You can see as it sort of begins its rotation and begins its climb, it decelerates a little bit, then it decelerates a little bit more, and then it ultimately crashes. Now, I am not entirely sure. ADSB data is usually pretty reliable. As you get closer to the ground, sometimes it loses a little bit of reliability. I'm not sure whether this is computed airspeed or this is airspeed that the aircraft was reporting for itself. Obviously, when the NTSB gets the flight data recorders, they're going to have very precise information about what airspeed the aircraft was at. 182 knots, we can see the aircraft rotate in the video that we have, and it just doesn't fly. Almost undoubtedly, there was some damage to the left wing, given how much flames there were there, given the fact that obviously there was enough damage to cause the engine to separate from the aircraft. So there was probably some damage to the left wing. There may have been some damage to the slats. It may have affected the ability of the aircraft to fly. The aircraft would want to fly at 182 knots. It would want to take off. For those of you who aren't aware, there's 3 speeds that we use as we depart. There's sort of 4 we pay attention to, and there's 3 that we use. So 80 knots is a speed that we pay attention to. A typical briefing prior to takeoff will be anything prior to 80 knots we'll reject. So if we have any issues, any alerts, any malfunction, someone sneezes wrong below 80 knots, I'm going to reject the aircraft. I'm on a passenger aircraft, I have flight attendants in the back. If they attempt to call me below 80 knots, I'm going to reject the takeoff because there may be a sick passenger in the back. Above 80 knots, it's critical items only. So there are only a handful of things I'll reject for. Engine failures, any fires, the ability to control the aircraft in question, or a wind shear alert. And then above V1, we take the aircraft flying, we manage it in flight, we come back around for a landing if we need to. So 80 knots is a differential between low speed reject and high speed reject. V1 is the go, no-go decision speed, and V1 is a speed at which it'd probably be around 130 to 140 knots. V1, it depends on the weight of the aircraft, the temperature, the conditions, ambient conditions. It varies a little bit, somewhere between probably 130, 140 knots. And that speed is the speed at which, if we have reached, then we're going to go fly, regardless of what happens, because we may not have enough runway to stop the aircraft. And if we go off the runway, we could go off at a fairly high rate of speed, and that's going to be very, very bad. We have enough redundancies aboard these aircraft that under most conditions, we can fly them even with a systems failure, an engine failure, for example, which is what happened here. You have a rotation speed, which is called VR rotate. Rotation speed is generally only a couple knots higher than V1. Sometimes it's the same speed as V1. On wet runways, it can be 10 or 15 knots faster. That's a flyable speed for the aircraft. If you rotate at that speed, the aircraft will fly at that airspeed. If you have an engine failure, in this case with the MD-11, you'd have 2 remaining functional engines. It's a 3-engine aircraft. With the 2 remaining engines, you can climb out if you rotate at VR, no problem. Accelerate to V2, which again, if you're 140 knots for rotate and 152 knots for V2, and you'll accelerate to V2 and during the rotation, then climb out at V2 till you get to a safe altitude. And we can see very clearly here where the rotation takes place. They show here November 4th, and this is Zulu time 22:13 is when it's showing the rotation took place, and shows the aircraft at a speed of 186 knots when the rotation took place. 186 knots, that aircraft would have flown. It would have climbed, it would have flown with 2 good operating engines, as long as they still had reasonable flight controls, ability to control the aircraft. The wing didn't break off the aircraft. The slats weren't too severely damaged. The wing wasn't too severely damaged. They would have been able to fly away or on their checklist, come back around and land. We see the aircraft rotate. It's hard to tell in the video, but it does appear to me that it had a pretty significant deck angle, that the nose was really pointed up, which would indicate they were trying to climb away at an airspeed that was insufficient. The wings are going to produce a lot of drag. They will produce lift, but they produce a lot of drag once you get above a certain angle of attack. Aerodynamically speaking, there's something that's called ground effect. Ground effect makes a lift that the wings produce much more efficient, and so it allows the aircraft to climb when it couldn't sustain flight at that speed otherwise. So you could lift off the ground in this ground effect, and once you get to 50, 100 feet, you're going to lose that ground effect. And when you lose that ground effect, you lose a lift. You have an extraordinary amount of drag. If you're at a slow airspeed at a high angle of attack, you only have partial thrust. You've lost thrust to one engine. You only have thrust in 2 other engines. You're not going to have the energy capability or the thrust capability to sustain flight, and you're going to come back down and crash, which is exactly what happened with them. So that will bear the question. We don't know. Maybe they reached the V1 speed. We can see There is a pretty good trail of smoke on the video of the takeoff roll. We also can assume that the individual who recorded that video wasn't just randomly recording videos of aircraft taking off. He actually witnessed something happen, maybe heard a large bang, saw the flames, retrieved his cell phone and started shooting that, which would be 5, 6, 7 seconds, you would think, at a minimum, before he was able to start shooting the video that we see. He pulled his phone out, heard something, saw something, pulled the phone out, began recording, and then captured this video of the result, which would indicate that this occurred substantially before, several seconds before the rotation, because we can see the rotation occur. It is pretty clear, I think, the rotation occurred at the very end of the runway. So it looks right now from the evidence that we have as though this event took place with a substantial amount of runway remaining. We don't know if they had enough to get the aircraft stopped. The ideal from pilot's perspective is that they were at or above V1, and so they had to continue the takeoff. With 2 operating engines, it shouldn't have been a big deal. Now that comes with a fairly large caveat. We can see that this is a dramatic damage event. The engine basically exploded, knocked itself off the airframe, which is fairly unprecedented, and left a huge ball of flame. Would have done a lot of damage. So there's a big caveat that maybe it couldn't have flown even at a normally safe airspeed. But if you have a hydraulic system issue, or if you have an electronic system issue, a single electronic system, a single hydraulic system, a single whatever, a fire detection loops that have failed, right? If they failed, they can't indicate fire, but you will get an alert that they failed. However, that very well on the MD-11 may be inhibited above 80 knots. From 80 knots to around 400 feet is usually where these things will be inhibited. They don't want to distract the pilots. They don't want the pilots, particularly in a high speed, 80 plus knots on the ground, they don't want them to be distracted by things they shouldn't be rejecting the takeoff for. So, like I said, a fire would be enunciated then. But if you had an explosion in the engine that destroyed the fire loops with the explosion that created the fire, you wouldn't get a fire indication. You'd certainly know something had happened as a pilot, but you may not get any indications that something had happened. You may be looking at your instruments. There's no fire indication. If you looked at your engine gauges, they may just all disappear. You may get blanks. And I've seen this actually. We were able to replicate this in a simulator in a Embraer 175, an aircraft I flew several years ago as a check airman on. And we did have a button in the simulator that was the engine separation button. You could push that button. It'd create a little jolt as the engine separated. It would simulate that. But then the only indication that you'd have the engine is separated is one set of gauges, all the left gauges, engine gauges, the N1 gauge, the exhaust gas temperature gauge, the exhaust pressure gauge, whatever gauges you had there, oil pressure, all those would just go blank. They would just go empty. And that was it. That was the only indication that you would have. And if you're in the inhibited portion of flight, you would not get any other alerts. You wouldn't get a caution alert, a yellow alert. You wouldn't get a warning alert, a red alert. You'd get no other alerts as a pilot. So it was very confusing. I went through it. I experienced it. The first time I saw it, I didn't know what had happened. I had no idea what happened. The person I was flying with had no idea what happened. It's why they demonstrated to it, showed it to us. I've only done that once in a fairly long career. I've only had one simulated engine separation event, so it's not a common thing to be trained for. It's not a common thing to be on the minds of pilots. But they may not have known what happened. So that could explain they hadn't reached V1. They were above 80 knots. They were in the high speed range. They weren't getting alerts. Something had happened. You're not supposed to reject in the high speed except for certain conditions. And if they were confused at a high rate of speed, they may have simply run out of runway before they had figured out that, what they needed to do. So we don't know right now. This is a heck of a scenario because it's not really a single failure type of a scenario. You have multiple failures that you're dealing with. You have ambiguity. You have the shock factor. You have a lot of things going on. And the NTSB will get into it. They'll have more data. We'll certainly know within a month they should have a prelim report out. That'll include the flight data recorder, the cockpit voice recorders, and we'll have a really good idea. We may not know exactly at that point what caused the engine to fail. We may not know the specifics. That may take a little bit longer, more research, but we'll certainly know the sequence of events that took place. The crew members aboard the aircraft, obviously, the innocent civilians on the ground, the innocent individuals on the ground who perished as well. Thoughts and prayers with them. We'll keep up to date with it. We'll let you know as we get to know more. I know a lot of these videos deal with an uncomfortable subject, that being mortality, obviously, the fact that life can be fickle. it can end with little notice. And for some people who've been right at that boundary, clinically dead but revived, the experiences they describe are remarkable. I've looked into the best documented cases, verified medical records, and peer-reviewed research in a full video. It's linked on the screen now. Once again, thanks for watching. Thoughts and prayers to the family members. Stay safe.